What is syndicalism? Syndicalism, or labor unionism, is an ideology that seeks to establish the labor union state, or the syndical state, most usually through a general strike across the nation. This general strike was depicted by syndicalism's foremost thinkers as the event that would lead to the inevitable collapse of contemporary commercial capitalism. Though nowadays the ideal of a general strike succeeding in bringing about the syndical revolution has faded. Syndicalism took heavy inspiration from the philosophy of Karl Marx in his call to mobilize the working class, in hopes for a struggle between productive and exploitative classes, and the necessity of a worker backed revolution to overturn the existing social system. On the other hand, from the pioneer of anarchism, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, syndicalism adopted its conception of the social function of private property, its support for the concept of a societal agro-industrial federation through which all of the economy would be conducted, and more. Syndicalism was, as noted by its thinkers such as Edouard Berth, inspired not only by Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Proudhon, but by the philosophers of the ancient world, with some of the first syndicalist intellectuals comparing the culture surrounding the syndicalist movement to the cultural attitudes of the ancient cities of Greece, more commonly known as the polis or the Greek city states. This ancient ideal that the syndicalists took as inspiration for their cause finds its roots in the 1864 book The Ancient City by Fustel de Coulanges, sorry for any French speakers if I butchered that, which endeavored to describe the ancient city's religious, social, and political structures. As the syndicalist thinkers throughout the 1910s described it, the ancient city was the ideal of a heroic city, civically religious in spirit, in which all institutions revolved around the ideals of struggle, war, and combat, which these figures considered as the source and principle of every virtue of civilization. When these virtues of the ancient city cracked, the syndicalist theoreticians expressed their belief that society, as it was known then, dissolved and gave room over time for the rise and dominance of societal decadence. Fernand Pelloutier, perhaps the first syndicalist intellectual to develop a systematized syndicalist ideology throughout the 1890s, wrote extensive critiques against traditional anarchist isolationism as well as parliamentary socialism. Throughout his writings, he hoped to bridge the gap between the trade union leaders and anarchist socialists while condemning the Blanquist, Guesdist, and Brucist socialists of his time, whose Marxist infighting had led to fracturing among the trade union movement in France. However, while Pelloutier laid the groundwork for the later syndicalist movement's ideology, he still was heavily anarchistic, something which later syndicalists would slowly begin to move away from as the ideology of syndicalism evolved. Georges Sorel, a former liberal conservative turned orthodox Marxist turned syndicalist, inspired by his friend Fernand Pelloutier, continued on as the intellectual leader of the French syndicalist movement after Pelloutier's death. Throughout his career, Sorel heavily engaged with contemporary and recent historical intellectuals such as Gustav Le Bon, an Italian psychologist who wrote The Study of the Popular Mind, Benedetto Croce, an Italian idealist philosopher, Émile Durkheim, a French sociologist, Alex de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat and historian, and Karl Kautsky, a social democrat. Many more, but some of these thinkers Sorel engaged positively with, such as Gustav Le Bon and Croce, while others he harshly critiqued, such as Karl Kautsky, Bernstein, and Jules Guesde, among other leading contemporary Marxists of the time. Sorel's primary contribution to the theories of syndicalism was the introduction of the conception of a revolutionary myth that would inspire workers to action through powerful imagery of victory. He recalled historical myths that succeeded in mobilizing the masses, such as the Second Coming of Christ in Christianity or the collapse of capitalism in Karl Marx's theories, as evidence that myths are a genuine factor that play into the ability for an idea to move people towards action. In the 20th century, the syndicalists proposed that the heroic and warlike ideals of the past had been revived and embodied in the modern institutions of labor, through which thinkers such as Edouard Berth and Georges Sorel maintained that the ideal of the modern city would be revived in the form of the ancient, as the needs of labor would revive in the hearts of men the ideals of the old world. In The Misdeeds of Intellectuals, a book written by Edouard Berth, the author characterized syndicalism as in continuity with the pre Socratic Greek philosophy, agreeing with Friedrich Nietzsche that modern society is the reign of the inactive, passive, and purely theoretical man, so to speak. In other words, the destroyer of the ancient, heroic, and warlike Greek city, as he put it, which had been built upon action. Originally, in syndicalism's first inception, The new equivalent to the warrior of the ancient city was to be found in the laborer of the factory, where weapons were replaced by the worker's industrial machinery, transferring the spirit of battle from the battlefield to the shop floor. This early syndicalism rejected class collaboration and had some harsh words to say on the role of the middle class in society. This early syndicalism broadly supported the endeavors of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, as the prime theoretician of syndicalism, Georges Sorel, threw his support behind Lenin, referring to the Soviets in his 1918 defense of Lenin as the new Rome of the proletariat, while the plutocratic capitalist powers at the time were referred to by Sorel as the Carthages of the world. Syndicalists Edouard Berth and Daniel Guerin also supported Lenin, later to be disheartened by the failure of Trotsky to take power in the USSR. By the time that Stalin succeeded in rising to power, essentially all syndicalist theorists unanimously rejected the Soviet experiment as a failure. Other syndicalists across Italy and France, such as Edmondo Rossoni, Gustav Herve, and Georges Valois, had turned their eyes to a kind of revolutionary nationalism, arguing not only that the specific kind of anti patriotic internationalism held by some early syndicalists had failed, but that the nation itself should become the subject of class struggle rather than domestic classes, as the differences between nations were more profound than the differences between domestic classes. These figures argued that it was very clear that the proletariat and petite bourgeoisie of an exploited and economically oppressed nation state had much more in common with each other than the proletariat of an economically exploitative nation had with the proletariat of an economically backwards or otherwise oppressed nation. This development in syndicalism was an elaboration upon the Sorelian syndicalist organization known as Cercle Proudhon of 1911 to 1914, which declared that it was necessary to combine the love of the nation alongside the syndical movement. They likely believed that this was the only way that the masses would be genuinely mobilized for popular action. Throughout the 1920s, most of the leaders of the syndicalist movement across Europe and the Americas came to reject anti nationalism, with even the most internationalist syndicalist theorists, such as Edouard Berth, returning to their fondness of revolutionary nationalism, which many of them held during the early 1900s. This new theory of proletarian nations and bourgeoisie plutocracies, combined with the syndicalist love for the warlike spirit of the ancient city, led to the curation of a sort of new syndicalism, commonly referred to as national syndicalism, which has, in modern scholarship, frequently been miscategorized as a current of the far right or as a third position, with the acceptance that all members of proletarian nations held a proletarian character as productive classes oppressed by the international plutocratic powers. The syndicalists invented a new kind of corporatism, intended, unlike the preceding popular Christian corporatism rejected by all syndicalists, not to pacify the various economic classes into social peace, but to invigorate the syndical state and mobilize the national energies together in a revolutionary manner. From this nationalistic syndicalism came the movement that established the progressive corporatist Free State of Fiume, whose constitution was written by the syndicalist organizer Alceste de Ambris, and heavily inspired by the Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta. The Syndicalist Party of Spain, which advocated for collaboration between the industrial working class, peasant farmers, technicians, and the intelligentsia in their official program. The Republican Syndicalist Party of France, led by the former Mussolini inspired Georges Valois, and various corporatist regimes around Western Europe, the Americas, and East Asia. The new development, which took syndicalism by storm in its evolution, which dictated that the nation itself was now the object of class struggle, envisioned classes and social groups being organized together on the basis of function and mutual interdependence and cooperation. On its face, many have misunderstood historical syndicalism as merely a parallel of council communism due to its staunch opposition to any collaboration with the liberal state, its tendency towards a kind of anarchism, and its goal to establish a society organized on the basis of labor organizations. As it may be made clear, or hopefully already has, this is a false perception. Although this fully fledged corporatism and revolutionary nationalism that existed within the syndicalist movement now was fully fledged and fleshed out by the 1920s, it wasn't exactly new. While the communists generally had advocated for an end goal society ran on the basis of local administrative worker councils composed solely of proletarians, the syndicalists had always held something new in mind. Fernand Pelloutier wrote his proposals for the role of labor unions in the future social society in his book History of the Bourses du Travail, published in 1901. Pelloutier approvingly quotes a labor union delegate from Roubaix, France, in chapter 1 of his book, who says of the labor unions, the labor union centers are actually organizing committees for a different kind of society. Each professional group elects a number of representatives in proportion to their share of the total number of citizens who compose the labor union. This system will keep abreast of every achievement. In Chapter 3, The Birth of the Bourses du Travail, Pelloutier explains the aid which the bourses, or French labor union councils, give to corporative or corporatist associations, stating the Bourse du Travail allowed the suppression of redundant services provided by the individual labor unions, helped coordinate the demands of the corporative groups, and study the exchange mechanism, in short, to seek within the current social system the elements of a new system. The French theorist Hubert Lagardelle, a follower of Sorel, though far more explicitly Marxian in flavor, while rejecting pure Catholic corporatism, stated, even within the earlier 1900s, that economic democracy can only be established by the creation of a technical government of selected workers, which also, within the groups thus established, follow rules opposed to those of political democracy. It will have a tendency to assure the permanence of its administrators, further stating that the exclusive primacy of the occupational groups, organs of a permanent government, competent and stable, is increasingly verified in the development of the working class. Georges Sorel's primary disciple, Georges Valois, argued in his 1934 book Doctrines and Techniques of the Revolution a much more advanced vision than what Pelloutier, Lagardelle, or Sorel first laid out in their theories. Please note the following excerpts are extremely spaced out from different portions in the book. After the war, I set up a confederation of production that made a lot of noise until 1925. It was with this that I launched the Economic Weeks, which had a certain impact, and that the plans of a corporate organization that Italian fascism copied, by its own admission, were made. We must effectively create the syndical and cooperative state, where, alongside a parliamentary assembly that remains to allow for major expressions of public opinion, there will be an assembly of delegates from syndicates and cooperatives, an assembly that, like the other, will be an expression of sovereignty. In other words, all power to the unions, meaning all unions incorporating men producing useful work, scientists and technicians, thus organically associated with proletarian formations. This results in a syndicalist based assembly constituted by economic sectors. It can be complemented by territorial representation delegated by municipalities themselves composed by unions, forming one or two chambers as experience advises. The syndicates will provide the framework for the essential structure of the state for economic and territorial representation and constitute, at all levels of economic and social life, the expression of the community while permanently defending labor. Within this book, Valois makes it clear that his 1925 plans for corporate organization were identical to those employed by the Fascist Party of Italy, although Valois' belief is that by 1934 Mussolini had since sold out to the capitalist class. Regardless of any illustrative comparisons that may be drawn, Valois' vision for a bicameral syndical legislature on the basis of functional regional representation could not be clearer, and it is a sentiment which would be repeated by subsequent syndicalist organizers and theorists around the world, including in the East by figures such as Dedapant Tengati, an Indian labor organizer, who wrote in his book Nationalist Pursuit, Sri Guruji, an Indian revolutionary nationalist, I should add, was of the view that the system of territorial representation is quite inadequate for fulfilling the aspirations of the people. Functional representation, which is in keeping with the Hindu tradition, must be brought into the picture and should at least supplement, if not replace, territorial representation. It is high time our leaders gave serious thought to these views and did the needful without further delay. Tengati further cites the ideals of Fernand Pelloutier, Petrim Sorokin, Peter Kropotkin, the French Syndicates Congress at Lyons of 1919, the official program of the Italian Fascist Party, etc., all as historical examples of this functional representation which he advocated for. Tengati today is considered one of the greatest intellectuals of Indian history, even influencing much of the policies which the present Indian government have enacted over the last 5 years. Tengati's Indian Workers' Union, or the BMS, the largest labor union in India, has also supported this idea, calling for, quote, workers of each major industry and minor industries or their trade groups to be given representation in the Lok Sabha, the lower legislative chamber, and the state assemblies. So, what is the goal of syndicalism? In short, it can be understood as the establishment of a government of organized professionals who have worked in their respective fields, laboring for their positions and representing the interests of their common productive industries, whether they be in fishing, manufacturing, farming, commerce, education, culture, etc. These bodies must, in theory, have full legislative power equal to Parliament and ideally come to replace it altogether. This would at once eliminate the arbitrary geographic divisions put in place by political democracy, destroy the electoral college, and ensure that those who produce are being represented by those who are aware of the unique problems facing their field. There is no meaningful primary geographical or regional position to be held on foreign policy, on legislation concerning mining codes or labor codes, or on the laws of medical science. Land does not vote, and it should not be given a position on these matters. This voice belongs to the nation, and there's no better way to ensure the representation of the people than handing power to the technicians who work in the fields they are being elected to represent and know the intricacies of. This is what is meant by the syndicalist vision of economic democracy. Syndicalist economics, through its utilization of the market economy alongside decentralized planning and the coordination of all national economic organs, at once resists the centralization, homogenization, and bureaucracy of communism, the exploitation, heavy class stratification, and coercion of free market capitalism, and the family unit centered approach taken by traditional Catholic corporatism that reinforces the old social laws and rules of ancient religious orders, thereby making syndicalism a formidable force both in history and in the present day, as it is still fought for by patriotic organizations and movements around the world in nations such as Argentina, Italy, India, Spain, Greece, Myanmar, and elsewhere.